My name is Dorothy Monroe, and I don't tell ghost stories. I tell the kind that leave fingerprints. When my son David died, his widow, Brenda, turned her grief into blame and aimed it at their 16-year-old daughter, Clara. I found that girl behind a store, hungry, shaking, and wearing a sweater that had forgotten warmth. I took her home and swore she would never be left on a doorstep again. Now Clara Monroe is Dr. Clara Monroe, a trauma surgeon at St. Grace Medical Center. Hands steady where the world trembles. On a rain-slick night, an ambulance barreled in carrying a woman with yellowed eyes and a failing liver, even with the ruin time had carved into her face. Clara recognized her. It was Brenda. There, beneath the harsh lights and the ticking of a dying clock. The past demanded an answer from the present. 10 minutes for lapse. For triage. For a decision no child should ever face as an adult. Save the mother who abandoned her. Or stand back and let the tide take what it would. Before we argue right and wrong, walk with me into the moment when everything we thought we knew began to tilt. David Monroe was only 38 when cancer hollowed him out. Leaving his wife Brenda and their daughter Clara behind, he worked 2 jobs to keep up with medical bills. But love and exhaustion couldn't save him. When he died, Brenda unraveled. Grief turned to bitterness, and she began drinking like she was trying to drown the world that had taken her husband. At the funeral, Brenda's sorrow boiled into cruelty. She stood in front of the congregation and shouted that Clara was the reason David got sick, that raising a child had bled them dry. The girl didn't speak. She just stared at her mother with tears cutting down her cheeks. That image of a mother destroying her child in public never left me. I drove from Portland to Denver the next morning. Hoping to reason with Brenda, I offered to let Clara stay with me until things steadied. But Brenda's voice was flat, almost careless. "Take her," she said. I never wanted her anyway. The next morning, they were gone. Brenda had emptied the bank account and vanished with her daughter. 3 months later, a neighbor called me about a girl scavenging behind a grocery store. It was Clara Thin. Filthy. Starving. I wrapped her in my coat, took her home, and promised her she was safe. She slept for 12 hours straight, the way only the frightened do when they finally stop running. That night, I became her guardian in every way that mattered. Even if the law hadn't caught up yet, people talk about saving children like it's simple. But it isn't. Saving them means fighting the ones who should have loved them most. And when Brenda came back demanding her daughter, I realized some battles for family aren't about blood at all. Clara began to rebuild her life inside the small rhythm of my house school. Homework. Dinners that smelled like home instead of fear. She carried her past like a quiet scar, visible only when she thought no one was watching. I enrolled her in Jefferson High, where teachers saw the brilliance beneath the bruised confidence. Within months, her grades soared, and her eyes began to look forward instead of back. She told me she wanted to become a doctor, her voice trembling as if the dream might break from saying it aloud. I told her she could be anything she wanted. And I meant it. We lived simply. But every dollar I saved went into her future textbooks, tutoring, even a used laptop that became her lifeline. Watching her study late into the night felt like watching a light return to a house that had long been dark. Brenda's shadow still lingered. Some nights, Clara woke from nightmares where her mother's voice called her name, slurred and cruel. But each morning she rose stronger. Folding her pain into purpose, she volunteered at the local clinic, wiping the brows of patients twice her age, already practicing the kind of compassion medicine can't teach. Years passed, and Brenda never returned. The world believed she was dead. And in a way, She was buried beneath her own choices. Clara graduated at the top of her class and earned a scholarship to medical school in Denver, the same city that once broke her family. I remember telling her, "You've turned survival into a profession." She smiled and said, "Then I'll spend my life saving what I once lost." That's the thing about ambition born from pain. It doesn't fade. It sharpens into something unstoppable. It was a quiet night at St. Wine Grace Medical Center when the ambulance doors burst open. Dr. Clara Monroe was finishing her shift, her scrubs stained with the usual reminders of survival and loss. The paramedics rushed in a woman thin, Houndy said, barely clinging to consciousness. The moment Clara leaned over the gurney to assess the patient, her body froze. Even through the ruin of illness, the face was unmistakable. It was Brenda. For 15 years, that name had lived only in court records and bad dreams. Clara had imagined every version of her mother's ending prison, overdose, or some nameless grave, but never this. Now, under the same hospital lights where she saved strangers, she was being asked to save the woman who had once left her starving in a motel room. Her pulse thudded in her ears louder than the monitors beside her. The attending physician gave the report: liver failure, advanced cirrhosis. Possible hours left. Clara's training told her what to do, but her heart refused to move. The weight of every sleepless night, every scar, pressed down like a verdict. She had 10 minutes to decide: treat Brenda as another patient, or let nature collect its debt. That night, in that sterile room, the story of their blood came full circle. Mercy and justice stood side by side, waiting for her choice. When Brenda regained consciousness, the room went silent, except for the hum of machines. Her voice was rough, a rasp born from years of drinking and regret. She asked to speak to Clara alone, saying there was something she should have told her long ago. Clara hesitated, torn between the doctor she'd become and the abandoned child still living inside her. Finally, she nodded, and I stepped out of the room, watching through the glass as the past began to surface. Brenda started with an apology, the kind that comes too late to mend anything. She said she had followed Clara's life from a distance, clippings of her college graduation, her first residency, her medical license, all kept in a worn envelope. She confessed she'd left not out of hate, but out of fear. Then, with tears soaking the hospital sheet, she told Clara the truth about David's death. He hadn't died from cancer. He'd been murdered. David, she explained, had gotten involved with men who used his construction business to launder money. When the debts grew too deep and he tried to back out, they made his illness look fatal. Brenda had discovered the truth too late. And when those same men threatened to come after her and Clara, she fled. She thought vanishing would save her daughter's life, even if it meant becoming the villain in her story. Clara listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When Brenda mentioned a man named Tony Marchetti, the one who had orchestrated the debt, something shifted in Clara's eyes. Brenda said he had been in the hospital recently, asking about her daughter, pretending to be from an insurance company. Her voice shook as she warned Clara that if Marchetti was looking for her, the danger wasn't over. Then she pressed a trembling hand to Clara's wrist and whispered about a safety deposit box, hidden proof of everything David had uncovered. When Brenda's strength gave out, Clara stood beside her bed, staring down at the woman who had destroyed her childhood and might now be saving her future. In that moment, love and fury lived side by side in her chest. What Brenda had done was unforgivable, but what she revealed could rewrite everything. Brenda died 2 days later, her final breath leaving behind more questions than peace. After the funeral, Clara found the safety deposit key exactly where Brenda said it would be, taped under a cracked soap dispenser in the hospital's staff restroom. We drove together to the First National Bank, both of us silent, carrying the weight of what we were about to open. Inside the small metal box lay a stack of old papers, a few cassettes, and a ledger in David's handwriting. Clara spread the contents across my kitchen table that night. There were detailed notes about shell companies, unmarked payments, and phone numbers written in code. The recordings were worse, David's voice negotiating with men who spoke in the cold language of crime. Clara's face went pale as she realized her father had risked everything to expose the people using his business as a front. He had gathered proof, but he died before he could use it. And now, the debt he died for was coming back for her. The next morning, 2 FBI agents came to Clara's office. They had been tracking Tony Marchetti for years and believed Brenda's story was true. Clara handed over every document and tape, hoping that doing the right thing would finally end it. But the agents warned her that Marchetti's network didn't forgive loose ends. The debts of the dead had a way of finding the living. That night, Clara sat at her dining table, staring at her father's handwriting. She could have walked away, changed her name, disappeared again, like her mother once had. But that wasn't who she was anymore. The frightened girl behind the grocery store had grown into a woman who refused to run. If her family's past had been built on silence, she would break it in the loudest way possible. 2 weeks later, Clara's decision to cooperate with the FBI led to a plan that terrified me more than anything else. They wired her clothes with a recorder and stationed agents nearby. But she would face Tony Marchetti alone. He had called her himself, smooth as a salesman, saying he wanted to clear up some old business. Clara agreed, her voice steady, even as her hands trembled when she hung up the phone. I knew that the same strength that saved her as a girl now might be the thing that got her killed. The meeting took place in a half-abandoned warehouse on the edge of Denver's industrial district. When Marchetti arrived, he looked like success, wrapped in expensive fabric-tailored suit, polished shoes, a predator disguised as a gentleman. Clara greeted him with the same professional calm she used in the operating room. He spoke first, his words sharp as glass, saying her father had left debts unpaid and that those debts didn't die with him. Each sentence dripped with menace, disguised as charm. Clara let him talk, asking quiet questions, pretending confusion. When she mentioned the safety deposit box, Marchetti's eyes narrowed, and his tone shifted from polite to dangerous. He admitted knowing her father's illness had been staged to cover the murder, almost bragging about how easily it had been arranged. His arrogance blinded him to the small microphone pinned inside her jacket. When he finally leaned in and said her father's death was necessary business, the last piece of his empire began to crumble. The sound of sirens broke through the night like a final judgment. FBI agents swarmed the warehouse, shouting commands that echoed against steel walls. Marchetti's hand went for his gun. But Clara was faster, stepping back, just as the agents pulled him to the ground. For the first time in her life, she looked into the eyes of the man who had destroyed her family and saw fear instead of power. As they dragged him away in handcuffs, he spat that it wasn't over. Clara stood still, her voice calm and unshaken when she answered that it had been over for 15 years. The girl who once hid from the world had ended it on her own terms. 6 months later, Tony Marchetti was sentenced to life without parole. The evidence David had collected and Clara's recording in the warehouse dismantled a network that had haunted our family for decades. When the judge read the verdict, Clara didn't smile or cry, she just exhaled, as if the air finally belonged to her again. Justice had come quietly, not with revenge, but with truth. At the hospital's memorial garden, Clara placed a small plaque beside her father's name. It read, David and Brenda Monroe. Their choices built the woman who saves lives. The inscription wasn't about forgiveness, it was about acknowledgement. The pain that once defined her now stood behind her. A shadow she'd finally learned to walk past. That evening, we sat on the porch watching the sun sink over Denver. Clara said she used to believe being a doctor meant saving lives. But now she understood it was about more than that. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Her voice carried the calm of someone who had faced every kind of loss and still chosen to heal. I looked at her, the child I'd once found trembling behind a grocery store. Now a woman who had turned survival into purpose. Some stories end in vengeance, but Clara's ended in something rarer peace. And that, I think, is the truest form of victory. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it struck a chord or reminded you of your own battles, share your thoughts below. Your voice matters here. Don't forget to subscribe for more true-to-life stories of justice, strength, and redemption. Until next time, take care of your peace.